Welcome to the Risk and Repeat podcast, episode number 227. I'm Rob Wright, Security News Director at Tech Target, and I am here with Senior Security News Writer Alex Kalafi. Alex, welcome.
Thanks, Rob.
How are you doing on this fine Tuesday, sunny, somewhat cold March day, March the 19th?
We're in Massachusetts,
Yeah,
and the deal with the devil that I feel like many Massachusetts natives need to make around this time each year is that you get the sun and it's gorgeous out, and it's the first gorgeous weather you've seen in like 3 or 4 months, but you also have the worst allergies
yeah.
of your life, and so it's good and bad is I guess the best way to answer your question.
I feel you, and we will try not to cough or
Sneeze.
sneeze our way
Yeah,
through this podcast, through this
sure.
recording. God help us, because we have a lot to talk about,
Mm-hmm.
Alex. We have been putting off this discussion for some time just because uh, there have been a couple of developments, several developments in it. It's a big story. We have been, I've been sort of anticipating more information coming out about this in the last week, but that doesn't look like it happened, or it did not happen. I think we can say that pretty definitively. So I think it's time to have at least the first part of a discussion about this. And I am referring to the Midnight Blizzard mess with Microsoft. Midnight Blizzard, aka APT29, aka Cozy Bear, aka the SolarWinds hackers. They got inside Microsoft. It is an ongoing situation that has worsened in recent weeks, and you've wrote about it,
Mm-hmm.
wrote about it a couple times, I believe. And why don't you just take us through what happens with Midnight Blizzard and Microsoft? I know there's a lot of pieces and moving parts to this mess, but it's something that is absolutely worth discussing.
Mm-hmm. And it's been going on a couple months now, and this is an interesting attack where, there's only been a couple developments in the events surrounding it, but I feel like it's been one of the only things you and I have been talking about in the last 2 months because there's a lot of weird elements to this attack.
Mhm.
So mid-January, January 19th, Microsoft disclosed an attack against them. They said a threat actor known as Midnight Blizzard, who is generally affiliated with the Russian government, also known as Cozy Bear, also known as APT29. The Midnight Blizzard accessed a very small percentage of Microsoft corporate email accounts. That's what they said. Via a password spraying attack against a legacy non-production test tenant account. The attack began in November. There was a very small percentage of Microsoft corporate email accounts, including members of our senior leadership team and employees in our cybersecurity, legal, and other functions, and exfiltrated some emails and attached documents. Okay, so that's what it was. And then there weren't a ton of significant developments after that point. And I'll also note that this was the Cozy Bear slash Midnight Blizzard. They also led the 2020 supply chain attack against SolarWinds,
Mhm.
which, if you're listening to this podcast, I'm sure you've heard of. And then on Friday, March 8th, Microsoft published a new blog post, or new then blog post, from the Microsoft Security Response Center, which is where all their disclosures generally come from. And they said that as a result of further investigation, they found that Midnight Blizzard gained access to source code and internal systems. And this is a quote from them. In recent weeks, we've seen evidence that Midnight Blizzard is using information initially exfiltrated from our corporate email systems to gain or attempt to gain unauthorized access. This has included access to some of the company's source code repositories and internal systems. To date, we have found no evidence that Microsoft hosted customer facing systems have been compromised. However, we don't know what source code was taken in this
Mhm.
attack. And in fact, someone I talked to, and for potentially future reporting on this, was basically saying like, yeah, depending on the source code they took, this could get a lot worse, or it might not, but it's an important point, I guess,
Hmm.
is the note here. And that Microsoft also said Midnight Blizzard is attempting to use secrets, meaning cryptographic secrets. So that's your keys, your passwords. And but it's like they don't really classify which secrets specifically. Um, and that it's the Midnight Blizzard is attempting to use cryptographic secrets it found during the initial breach. Um, Although Microsoft said there was no evidence that customer-facing systems had been compromised, a number of these secrets were exchanged in emails between Microsoft and customers. And
Mm.
so there are a few interesting details here that I'll just sort of lay out before we sort of pass it to you. One, um Microsoft did not say that no customers have been affected in any way by this. They
Hmm.
did not say that they weren't. And I think we asked and I think they said nothing.
Mm.
If I remember right.
Yes.
Um Two, we don't this sounds very different from the initial breach of email accounts.
Hmm.
And Rob, you and I were talking about how this sounds like a second breach disclosure, but Microsoft was sort of talking about it as if it was part of the initial one. Um, and that was something we were curious about, was would this count as a completely second breach, because source code and internal systems are kind of a lot different from getting into email accounts. So that's a question that remains. Um, and then just the third thing I think we've been thinking a lot about is how Microsoft has been trying to bring a lot of its trustworthy and transparency messaging back over the fall.
Hmm.
And they dropped this blog post on a Friday morning, which isn't Friday afternoon, to be fair, but it is Friday morning. And I think it followed a lot of Friday afternoon disclosures in the last year or two, whenever Microsoft did something that I guess got them in trouble with the larger security community. Um, so it's, I guess, the third thing we're thinking about is, um, with so many questions remaining, can we really call this an improvement of the Microsoft we've been seeing over the last year or two?
Yeah. And I think that's a good one. I mean, to your last point, they had announced not too long ago SFI, their Secure Future Initiative, that they put together as sort of a, security memo version 2 under Satya Nadella and the current leadership at Microsoft to try to, improve things. Let's just
Mm-hmm.
be honest and call it what it is, improve things from a security perspective. And the one thing that I thought was interesting in that initial blog post on January 19th was, the initial disclosure. So this isn't, at this point, we don't know source code has been impacted. We don't know internal systems have been impacted. There's no indication that customers may have been put at risk, the customer secrets. So none of that is out there. And in
Mm,
fact, I'll note that in that disclosure, they said to date, there's no evidence that the threat actor had any access to customer environments, production systems, source code, or AI systems. Obviously, the source code part turned out not to be true. But they also said, this incident, I'll quote them, this incident has highlighted the urgent need to move even faster, end quote, on SFI. And that's probably the most self-aware thing I had seen from Microsoft in a while. I think they know the heat has been turned up on them. This goes back to the Storm 0558 attack, where a Chinese nation state threat actor had breached the company, and that was pretty serious. The whole question about the customer signing key that was used in attacks, and they were sort of, I don't want to say clueless, but they didn't know how it had been obtained. Um, that was a bad episode for them. We talked about it many times on this podcast. And lo and
Hmm.
behold, here comes another nation state attack. And they know that, hey, here's another breach and we got to move quickly. Now, this month, it's even worse. You're talking about customers that could have potentially been breached. And I'll take this opportunity to note that, I mean, there was a story that we did, I think you wrote it, back in January, where HPE disclosed that they suffered a cyber attack that they believe was perpetrated by Cozy Bear, by Midnight Blizzard.
Hmm.
So you start wondering, like, was this in any way connected to the breach at Microsoft? You know, they didn't say in their 8K, they didn't comment on about this at the time, but your mind starts to wander.
Hmm.
And I think this changes the equation for them quite a bit, because I think
Yeah.
if there are customers that have been impacted, I think they're in serious trouble.
Yeah.
Now, what kind of trouble? I don't know. I mean, now Nadella, I think he just completed his 10-year 10-year anniversary as head of Microsoft. It's getting a lot of glowing press about how
Hmm.
much the company has grown and the market cap being whatever it is, 3 trillion. Um, and it seems like a lot of that coverage and a lot of the praise that is being directed at Microsoft, there's very little mention of things like this, like the Storm 558 attack or this latest breach. I just wonder what customers must be feeling if they're looking at this and you just don't, I mean, we don't see these types of incidents, or haven't seen these types of incidents at Google, at AWS. I mean, Facebook's a different type of company, but you get the point.
Hmm.
And I just wonder what must be going through customers' heads right now, thinking about this breach, thinking about their secrets being exposed. And why didn't Alex, why did they not know if they had triangulated the number of email accounts that had been impacted initially back when they discovered the breach on January 12th, put out the disclosure on January 19th?
Hmm.
How did they not know that secrets that were putting customer at risk had been exposed? It just seems really strange to me. Or maybe they did and they just didn't say it.
I,
I don't know.
I obviously would hate to presume to know the status of their investigation when we just don't have visibility
Sure.
um into it. Like there's a chance that they did know, but not enough to put it in MSRC post. There's a chance that they didn't fully know, but they suspected. There's a chance that they did know and were being dishonest. I guess that's also another possibility.
Yeah.
It's hard to say, as I guess short story long.
Well, let's take a harder look here at the most recent disclosure, because
Sure.
you brought up a number of questions that I think are worth contemplating,
Mm,
because there's there's not a lot of detail in this March 8th post. We
mm-hmm.
don't get a lot of information. And I guess when I first read it, I initially thought to myself that, wow, this is bad. It sounds like they evicted the threat actors, the Midnight Blizzard actors, or at least thought they had evicted them. Didn't realize they had gotten additional data and exfiltrated it back in January or whatever. I think they said the attack started around November of 2023,
Mm-hmm.
and didn't realize they had information that they could use to gain additional access or return. So I read that post as like, wow, they got this information. Microsoft didn't realize it, and they came back into Microsoft's network. So it's almost like a second attack, a second breach, a repeated breach.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know. Do you think that's right? Or do you think that maybe they were, because the initial post in January doesn't say anything about them being evicted. It just says, ongoing investigation. I guess you could say it's strongly implied that they cut off all access. and that they believe they had evicted the threat actors, but that January post doesn't say that. So I don't know. What do you think? What was your first read on that March 8th post, and whether this was, quote unquote, a second attack, or this is just a continuation and the guys had been in there all along?
So I don't know. I'm pulled in multiple directions because part of me is like, are we just talking semantics about whether this is two attacks or one attacks? I'm not saying that's the case, but I am saying that that's something that I initially think about. Is like, does it really matter, or does it just matter that Microsoft got hit this hard, and it's their nth attack in 4 years or
Yeah,
whatever?
yeah.
So that's the first direction I'm pulled in. The second is, um, I think there's a pretty good chance that this was a follow-on attack. I'm not saying probable, but I am saying it's like it's worth considering. It's at least
Mhm.
up to that percentage level.
Right.
The third thing I'm thinking of is like, speaking from the journalist side of things, but I'm sure plenty of other security professionals and Microsoft customers are thinking the same, which is like almost frustrated that I have to consider this question this much instead of just them saying we're looking to see if customers were affected. We don't think any were, but we'll let you know, right? Or this was part of the initial attack and we learned more as we investigated,
Yeah.
and we are still learning more and we will keep you up to date,
Hmm.
right? But there's no line like that. There's vague use of the word customer.
Hmm.
It's like two or three, it's maybe it's not 300 words, but it feels like it's like 300 words. And it's like it's trying to stuff like five important details into single vague sentences. And I'm just left with a feeling of like, why the biggest security company in the world gets hacked
Mm.
in some way. 2 months have passed,
Hmm.
and we don't know that much. And it doesn't feel like we don't know much because of the investigation, or because of it feels like we don't know what we don't know because Microsoft's deciding not to say,
Yeah.
not because they don't know. And that's me speaking from feeling in saying that. It's not like there's not it's not factual,
Right.
but that's how it feels, and that's my read on this, and I find that a little frustrating.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know.
I,
Are you in this similar place?
I am. I'll just say, I think if they knew, I feel pretty confident that if they knew those secrets had been exposed and that those secrets could be used to, or if they knew that the data that was exfiltrated initially from the corporate email systems,
Mm-hmm.
whether it was secrets or whatever, that could be used for these guys to gain additional access to things like source code, they 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 would have said that. But they seem pretty, I mean, they said flat out in that initial post that, there's no indication that they accessed source code.
Mm-hmm.
And that clearly was not true.
Yeah.
And I don't think they would have said that if they thought there was a chance. So I think part of this has taken them by surprise. Now, we should note that they filed an SEC, an 8K that is on or about very similar to what they posted on March 8th
It
in the
might even
blog
have
post.
less. It might even have less content in it.
Yeah, but very similar. So that tells you that they felt compelled, to me, they felt compelled to put something out, even as incomplete and as vague as this is, which it is,
Mm-hmm.
because they feel like this is a major event that could have major implications for them, uh, financially, reputation wise, who knows? But it's material. Otherwise, they wouldn't be making that 8K filing. Uh, I so I don't know. I think that they may be feeling a little humbled, and they may be feeling a little gun shy. I know from talking with CISOs that have gone through breaches, there is a lot of reluctance among InfoSec executives out there, InfoSec leaders and companies in general, I'll say, to
Mm-hmm.
provide more information than is necessary and to put stuff out that they are even like kind of like 90% sure about. They want to be pretty sure that what they're putting out is definitive and that they're not going to have to say, whoops, sorry, we were wrong. That's the
Mm-hmm.
last thing you want. So, and like I said at the top of the conversation, I thought they were going to have another something coming or something would end up in the press, through sources, anonymous sources or whatever to try to clear some of this up. We still have nothing. It's been more than a week. It's going to be 2 weeks on Friday.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. What I do know though is it's already a bad look from the stuff that we discussed. It's even worse, I think, when you put it in further context. And what I mean by that is back in January, they disclosed in a sort of a guidance update for Midnight Blizzard threat activity. They had said that legacy test, non-production, whatever legacy test account, um, that it did not have MFA protection. So no
Mm-hmm.
multi-factor authentication, which was a pretty important detail that they did not disclose back in January. And, that kicked off a lot of criticism. You covered some of the criticism from InfoSec researchers, executives, vendors out there, similar to what we heard, the things we heard about Storm 0558 and what went down there. But this was really interesting because, after that disclosure or that update, I should say, came out, I started thinking like, wow, this sounds really familiar, or the details about this attack and what they did. And I knew I had heard something about it before. And lo and behold, I started combing through some of our old coverage, some of Microsoft's old posts, and I realized I wasn't crazy that they had put out at least a couple, I think in 2022 and maybe 2023, early 2023, research posts and guidance about how threat actors, specifically nation state APTs, were using almost the exact same tactics and attack patterns on Microsoft customers. Password spraying and brute forcing high risk accounts that had been left unprotected, had no MFA, getting access to those accounts, using them to create or abuse OAuth apps that allowed them to move laterally. And specifically, I mean, there's one post that specifically says we've seen these threat actors use password spraying to get these cloud accounts, high risk cloud accounts that have no MFA, and then they use the OAuth apps to connect to the victims' corporate email systems. Now, Microsoft has never said anything in their own disclosures about the Midnight Blizzard attack. I don't think about OAuth apps, whether they were abused or whether the threat actor had created malicious OAuth apps to connect to, the email system or whatever. But the fact that they knew, and specifically Midnight Blizzard, one of the posts says Midnight Blizzard. The fact
Mm-hmm.
that they knew that this was the MO and they knew this threat actor and these types of threat actor, but this one specifically, Midnight Blizzard, was doing these exact same things. And they're out there putting in their guidance, make sure all of your accounts have MFA. Make sure you don't have any assets, any cloud accounts, any instances, any tenants, nothing, unprotected with multi-factor authentication. And lo and behold, it turns out that they didn't even follow their own advice. And this is how they got hacked. I mean, it was such an incredible detail to me that they knew. I mean, they knew. Now I sound like I'm yeah, I'm getting a little carried away. But they
Listen,
did.
Rob, defenders can detect, investigate, and remediate identity-based attacks using solutions like Microsoft Entra ID protection. Don't forget that.
So yeah, I want you to touch on before we wrap up, just, you wrote that story not too long ago, post the initial disclosure about InfoSec researchers, about the MFA thing and the InfoSec executives just saying, here we go again with Microsoft. And there was some pretty intense criticism in that article.
Yeah, it was after the initial disclosure of a breach. I sort of asked some vendors, some executives. I was like, "What do you think about all this?" And to be honest, I didn't even need to ask that many people because some folks were already doing their own blog posts about how frustrated they were.
Yep.
And perhaps the best point or the most interesting, striking point I saw during that whole process was Alex Stamos, former Facebook CISO,
Hmm.
um, pretty famous guy in the security community. He did a blog post on LinkedIn at the time, and he was criticizing Microsoft for downplaying elements of in that initial blog post, which was a lot of the stuff we're talking about now.
Hmm.
And he also pointed out that Microsoft used that initial blog post to pitch elements of its own security products to either customers or maybe you could even argue Microsoft was saying that to people who were already customers, but still it wasn't a great look. I was sort of jokingly saying, but Microsoft did literally say in that initial blog post, defenders can detect, investigate, and remediate identity-based attacks using solutions like Microsoft Entra ID protection.
Yeah,
Despite this being about an identity attack that Microsoft
I
themselves
know.
experienced. Stamos called it morally indefensible, and Microsoft ended up telling us when I sort of reached out to ask about some things, including this, we sort of got a broad statement. They said, like, oh, security is a team sport and success is achieved through industry cooperation, as we demonstrated by publicly disclosing this attack just days after we became aware and then following up with the results. The attack highlights the continued risk posed to all organizations. Um, yeah. So it's not so much our place to weigh in personally on stuff like this, but the thing I hear over and over again, and I feel a similar frustration as someone who has to cover Microsoft, is the idea that Microsoft, being the guardians of Windows,
Hmm.
having Office, having 365, which how many enterprises use 365 or a version
Hmm.
of 365 by this point? Microsoft products are built in everywhere. Windows security at the personal computer level, I know it's different at the enterprise level, but at the personal computer level, is built in for free at every installation of Windows. So it is probably the most pervasive endpoint security tool in the world now as well, something that's happened in the last few years. And so Microsoft is the guardian of the security space. Um, and it's frustrating because you want them to take that responsibility really seriously. And once in a while, maybe they do. They did some good work around the Russia's invasion of Ukraine when they were sort of helping support Ukraine. It's not that they don't do anything, but you see attacks like this, the one we're talking about today, and you see Microsoft's very vague communications around it. And you see the attacks that Microsoft experienced in the last few years, I think going back to SolarWinds, and how they handled each of those attacks. Um, and you just go like, why is this the way it comes across as someone cynically putting their products first, even though they're a business. It's like putting their products first and not really much at all, it feels like,
Yeah.
considering the security implications of what they're doing and who they are.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I do think they take their role seriously internally. It's just that externally, like the messaging, the tone, there's something lacking there. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and it does feel like sometimes, at least in these statements, that they are putting their public image and their products ahead of, just being upfront and just saying, calling it what it is. Just like, we messed up. We're
Mm-hmm.
sorry. We need to fix this. We're going to move. I mean, they did say they're going to move faster, but like, I don't know. I don't, I mean, there needs to be something in this March 8th statement that puts it in context. Like, hey,
Mm-hmm.
we thought we were pretty sure source code wasn't affected. We said source code wasn't affected. It was. Come on. Like,
You
so
don't even need sorry. Like,
right,
sorry, who cares? It's more like clear communication about what they knew at the time, what they knew now,
right,
what they're still figuring out, and
right,
when they will try to know more. Or even if they don't include that last part, even just the first two parts are good enough,
right,
you
right.
know?
And again, at this stage, we are still waiting for that. We're still waiting. We'll see. It's March 19th. There's more time coming.
Mm-hmm.
But I think for now we can wrap it up there.
Sure.
Uh Alex, I appreciate you taking me through the Midnight Blizzard mess and helping me out on this discussion.
Anytime.
And, and thank you to the readers and listeners of Tech Target and the Risk and Repeat podcast. I'm Rob Wright, and we'll see you next time.